What if the protests you saw on Portland streets were only the most visible phase of a much longer story? What if the fires, the marches, the chanting crowds, and the nightly confrontations were not the end of a movement, but a transition point? This documentary is not about ideology. It is not about slogans, symbols, or political identity. It is about tactics, about adaptation, and about what happens when public protest fades from view, but organized activity continues behind the scenes. Tonight, we begin an investigation into claims that parts of Portland's protest ecosystem evolved from street-level activism into something quieter, less visible, and far more difficult to measure. This is Episode 1. The street spectacle fades. In 2020, Portland, Oregon became a symbol. For months, the city appeared nightly on television screens across the United States and around the world. Downtown streets filled with demonstrators. Federal buildings became focal points. Law enforcement lines formed and reformed under constant pressure. The images were unmistakable. Crowds moving through city blocks. Smoke drifting under streetlights. Chants echoing between concrete and glass. For many viewers, these scenes came to define what protests look like in the modern era. But images, by their nature, are selective. They capture what is loud, what is dramatic, what happens in the open. They rarely capture what happens after the cameras leave. And they almost never capture what happens when movements begin to adapt. Historically, protest movements follow a recognizable cycle. They emerge in response to an event. They grow through visibility and momentum. They peak when attention is highest, and then they either dissipate, fragment, or transform. Portland followed that pattern, at least on the surface. By mid to late 2020, nightly demonstrations were still occurring, but attendance fluctuated. Media coverage remained intense, yet increasingly repetitive. Law enforcement tactics evolved. Arrests accumulated. Legal consequences mounted. At the same time, activists were learning. They were learning which tactics attracted attention, which tactics triggered enforcement, which actions carried personal cost. They were also learning something else. Visibility, while powerful, came with a price. Public protest is, by definition, exposed. Faces are visible. Voices are recorded. Movements are tracked. In a digital environment, exposure does not end when a protest ends. Photos persist online. Videos are archived. Social media posts are saved, shared, and analyzed. For participants, this reality changes behavior. Some disengage. Some reduce involvement. Some adapt. According to journalists, researchers, and court records, this adaptation began to take shape in Portland as the protest cycle extended. The goal was no longer just to be seen. It was to survive. By late 2021, the visible signs of Portland's protest movement had diminished. Large crowds became rare. Nightly confrontations faded. National media attention shifted elsewhere. To an outside observer, it appeared as though the movement had lost momentum, but activity did not disappear. It relocated. Organizing channels that once focused on mobilizing people to physical locations increasingly focused on sharing information, not schedules, not routes, not chants. Information. Online discussions shifted in tone. Participants emphasized documentation, record everything, photograph interactions, capture badge numbers, save license plates, archive social media profiles. Individually, these actions appear defensive. Collectively, they signaled a change in mindset. Information was no longer temporary. It was becoming persistent. And persistence changes the nature of data. It is important to be precise. Information gathering is not inherently malicious. Journalists gather information. Researchers gather information. Civil rights organizations gather information. Activists, particularly those who believe they're being surveilled, often view information as a form of protection. Knowing who is present can feel like safety. Identifying patterns can feel like control. Sharing details can feel like empowerment. But there's a threshold. a point at which defensive awareness becomes proactive monitoring, a point at which information is no longer used once, but stored, a point at which documentation becomes surveillance. That threshold is rarely announced. It is crossed gradually. Modern technology accelerates this shift. Smartphones are always present. Cameras are always recording. Cloud storage is inexpensive and permanent. Social media platforms allow users to reconstruct timelines, identify individuals, and cross-reference behavior across years. What once required institutional resources can now be done by small groups or individuals. This does not require coordination from a central authority. It requires familiarity and repetition. One of the defining features of modern activist movements is decentralization. There is rarely a single leader, rarely a unified command structure, rarely a written strategy. Instead, tactics spread horizontally. If something works, others adopt it. If something fails, it is abandoned. This model offers resilience, but it also creates ambiguity. When no one issues orders, responsibility is shared. When everyone participates a little, accountability is diffuse. This matters when examining shifts in behavior. No single group needs to declare a change in strategy for that change to occur. It only needs to be normalized. Publicly accessible posts from the period show increasing emphasis on tracking, identification, and record-keeping. Screenshots circulated widely. Archived posts resurfaced months later. Information was reused. Not all of this activity was coordinated, but coordination is not required for patterns to form. What matters is that the behavior became routine, and routine behavior shapes culture. The visual symbols of protest, flags, banners, street art, gradually gave way to something less visible. Files, folders, databases, formal or informal, spreadsheets, encrypted message threads. The street spectacle faded. The records remained. At first glance, the shift may appear insignificant. After all, movements adapt constantly, but the implications extend beyond Portland. They raise broader questions about protest in a data-driven society. When does self-protection become surveillance? Who controls the information that is collected? How long does data retain influence over people's lives? These questions affect more than activists. They affect journalists, researchers, private citizens. Anyone whose presence in a public space can be recorded, cataloged, and revisited. This series does not claim that a single organization transformed into a centralized intelligence operation. There is no evidence to support that conclusion. Instead, this investigation examines something more subtle, a cultural shift, a tactical evolution, a move away from visibility toward information. Understanding this shift requires examining its origins, and that is where we turn next. In Episode 2, we explore how early information sharing began, why it was embraced, how it demonstrated power, and how that perceived effectiveness encouraged expansion, because once information proves useful, it rarely remains unused. This has been Episode 1. The street spectacle fades. Stay tuned, and as always, be safe. Welcome to the Inner Circle. This isn't just a membership, it's a mission. You're supporting forensic truth, mythic blends, and ceremonial broadcasts that honor every moment. Members unlock exclusive enhancements, behind-the-scenes alerts, and direct access to the pulse of Scape news and leading sponsor, Gold Rush Fever Specialty Coffee. Join us and help shape the signal. We thank you, and as always, stay safe. That's the latest from Scape news. We're live, we're watching, we thank you. Subscribe, like, share, and ring the bell so you don't miss what breaks next. Stay with us, we appreciate you, and as always, be safe.